What's up, guys? Static in the Attic. I hope everybody had a beautiful Memorial Day weekend here in the US, and everybody else out there in the world. Hope you had a great weekend. I got out for a nice little walkabout through basically soggy jungle rainforest type conditions. It was a beautiful hike. I may have to put together a little video compilation of some of the footage and share with you guys. But hope you guys had a good weekend. Let's get back into things. I'm going to stick with the time frame of the 1300s, like my last video, showing how the Mississippian culture started their demise at that time. That was the fall of Cahokia. I did a little comparative European history and everything. In this video, we're going to go over what was going on in the UK and England during this time frame. It's known for having the Great Famine of 1314 to 1315. And first, let's talk about the catalyst that set all of these things in motion. I've noticed lately that mainstream news outlets such as Newsweek here are starting to touch on the subject of grand solar minimum. And even Snopes ran an article debunking, you know how Snopes debunks everything. They're on the dole for sure. But in their article, I read through it, and they're debunking the grand solar minimum, saying, no, it won't be an ice age. No, it won't be glaciation and all of this. And that was their debunk story. But they did not touch on the subjects of shorter growing seasons, crops not being able to grow at the more extreme north and south latitudes, the increased risk of prolonged drought followed by flooding. You know, they left all of that alone and just said, no, we're not going to go into a glaciation type ice age. That's the way Snopes operates. At least Newsweek here did inform their readers a little bit, saying that the sun has entered an unusually quiet period with the number of sunspots appearing on the surface unusually low. This level of activity is so low, some scientists have suggested we may be entering a deep solar minimum, and potentially even a grand minimum, the last of which took place in the 17th century and coincided with a mini ice age. Now, that would have been the Maunder minimum. I guess the Dalton minimum didn't qualify according to this researcher, but we'll touch more on that in a little bit. The Dalton minimum was pretty bad itself. In April last year, scientists at NOAA predicted the forthcoming solar minimum would be similar to the last cycle. They're talking about the last 11-year cycle. In a statement, Lisa Upton, PhD, solar physicist with the Space Systems Research Corp, said the next solar cycle would be much like the last, with a weak maximum and a long, deep minimum. I want to remind everybody that back in 2018, the FBI came in to Sunspot, New Mexico, and shut down the solar observatory under the guise of a janitor pedo guy. But they shut it down for 11 days, and I'm still thinking that possibly somebody was in there that saw something out of their pay grade, and they shut it down to make sure that they knew exactly what they were seeing. This was just before the sun went blank, and we started having all the crazy weather. One example is just yesterday, they're calling it a once-in-a-decade storm that hit Western Australia. Major winds, rain. There were no casualties reported in this, thankfully. But, guys, there's a channel out there called The Two Preachers, and this is one of those things that's out of sight, out of mind. And the mainstream, from what I've seen, is not reporting on this at all. But, guys, there is still intense flooding. There's untold devastation going on around the world right now. That channel, The Two Preachers, does an excellent job of cataloging all that. And they always come up with really good footage to show you what's really going on out in the world. And like I said, it's one of those out of sight, out of mind kind of things. But it's been weird the last couple of years. That's all I can say. Even my friends here that have no idea what a grand solar minimum is, they just keep saying, well, the seasons are off, because they are. Everything is about a month behind here where I'm at right now. So in the last video, we covered the fall of Cahokia, a city right outside of St. Louis, Missouri, USA. That was during the 1300s. Researchers still argue back and forth whether it was drought, whether it was flood. According to the comparative histories that I've done, it was a combination of both. It was an extended period of drought followed by massive flooding. And then we also know from the 1811, 1812 New Madrid earthquakes, some of the most powerful earthquakes in our modern era happened right there in that area. So let's jump over to the UK and talk about the Great Flood and Famine of 1314. Eventually, I plan to have a whole series of videos regarding this time frame. To me, this was the big reset and the catalyst for the mudfloods, because along with the intense droughts and famines, you also have a major uptick in the earthquakes and volcanoes. During the winter and spring of 2013 and 2014, Britain suffered a prolonged period of destructive winter storms, resulting in widespread flooding and damage. However, this was not the first time that the country has been devastated by heavy periods of rain and bad weather. It rained almost constantly throughout the summer and autumn of 1314, and then through most of 1315 and 1316. So 3 years of really bad weather in the UK. Crops rotted in the ground, harvests failed, and livestock drowned or starved. So you just got your pigs out there, and the little mud hole turns into a pond, and the pigs drown, evidently. I bet that was a mess. Food stocks depleted, and the price of food soared. The result was the Great Famine, which over the next few years is thought to have claimed over 5% of the British population. Seeing how long it took the country to recover and then turn into a world power, I'm going to guess that it was more than 5%. But I think they learned their lesson and started using these cycles to their benefit as far as conquering other countries, especially the 1812 era. It was the same or even worse in mainland Europe. The shortage of crops pushed up prices of everyday necessities such as vegetables, wheat, barley, and oats. Bread was therefore also expensive, and because the grain had to be dried before it could be used, of very poor quality. Salt, the only way at that time to cure and preserve meat, was difficult to obtain because it was much harder to extract through evaporation in wet weather. Its price rose dramatically. Salt was not only important for the preservation of their meats back in the day, of course this is before refrigeration, but it's also an important electrolyte to keep your body absorbing water. And so I don't know if they have salt mines over in England, but they've definitely got the ocean. So you just set up evaporation tables or whatever and evaporate the water, and you're left over with the salt. Well, it's kind of like me trying to dry out my soggy hiking boots that are no longer waterproof. It's been so moist out that I can't dry them out sitting outside. And so they were having this problem with the nonstop rain and humidity that was in the air. They couldn't evaporate off the water and get the salt that they needed, let alone the fact that they didn't have food to feed the livestock and that it was raining so hard that some of the livestock drowned. In 1315, Edward II decreed that the price of basic foodstuffs be limited. So this may have been the first time, the earliest recorded account of government stepping in and fixing prices. But this did not, however, do much to mitigate the crisis. The traders simply refused to sell their goods at these low prices. In the end, the act was abolished at the Lincoln Parliament in 1316. So they tried to fix the food prices, and everybody that was holding big stocks of food just said, well, no, I'm not going to sell. That's usually what happens when government interferes. This happened during the 1812 Dalton Minimum era. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, people were starving on the streets in New York City while farmers were plowing under their vegetables. This was before the Dust Bowl actually hit. This was right after the stock market crash. And to the sensible mind, It sounds absolutely ludicrous that you would have people starving in one area of their own country while farmers in a different area are plowing their vegetables under. It's all because the supply chain broke down. We are seeing the exact same thing happening right now today with this planned bugdemic that they have out there. Farmers that have their supply chains routed directly to their distributors that go directly to the restaurants, and that's who they sell to. That is their clientele. Those supply chains have broke down. The restaurants are no longer open. I listened to one farmer talk about millions and millions of pounds of cabbage that he had to plow under. And then he started talking about his buddies that are farmers and all of the crops that they had to plow under. At this point in time, there is no shortage of anything in the United States. Now, other countries aren't faring quite as well, but at this point in time, there are no shortages of anything. This all has to do with the government stepping in, imposing the Patriot Act on crack. I mean, they are just doing away with all rights. The end result of this will be no more small big businesses. It's going to be all corporations. They're going to take over the farmlands. That's just all there is to it. The farmers are not going to be able to survive this for the most part. Some farmers out there say that they are losing up to $200,000 a day in revenue over this. And to me, what this looks like right now is 100th monkey conditioning. They created this pre-planned bugdemic that we just went through phase 1 of, that they are adamant they were going to have phase 2 of. And they are training everyone to just accept it when they say, okay, well, we're going to have to go back on lockdown. There's been another outbreak. There's another wave of this. And everybody is pre-programmed to accept the food rationing because it just happened. I mean, even in rural America where I am, they have limits, 2 packages of meat. So I definitely think they're pre-programming everyone for the years to come, having a contingency plan for if we do run into major food shortages. And some of the third world countries out there, I mean, the newspaper articles are straight saying that we're looking at famine of a biblical scale here. Not to mention the fact that there's been 3 major locust storms in the last year. North Africa, China, and now India. Now back to 1316 England, the situation got worse and worse as the rain continued to fall. It was reported that there was even no bread at St. Albans for the king and his court when they stopped off there on the 10th of August, 1315. Things were particularly bad in the north of England, and especially in Northumbria, where the people were already struggling due to the looting by Scottish raiders. The population here resorted to eating dogs and horses. I have long thought that the Viking raids on England were more out of necessity than the Hollywood version that we get. I think the Vikings wound up raiding England and other areas because of a climate shift, and they could no longer support themselves in their area. So in 1315, resources got scarce, and then the Scottish started coming down and attacking England, probably just so that they could feed themselves. And they say that they resorted to eating dogs and horses. Now, an interesting fact about the Dalton minimum, I've talked about the Mount Tambora explosion several times, causing that was 1815, causing a year without summer in 1816. Now, if you're a subsistence farmer, you've got your yearly routine, you know how much food it takes to get you through the winter into next spring. Now, if summer doesn't come and you're not part of a kingship or some type of community that has large stores of grain bins, if you're just out in rural wherever and you're a subsistence farmer, if summer never comes, then you're going to starve. You're not prepared for that. I don't think the average person would have been prepared to skip a whole growing season. A good example of necessity being the mother of all invention, in 1818, Baron Karl von Dros of Baden, Germany, patented the design for a two-wheeled Luftmaschine, or running machine. It consisted of two wheels in line beneath a seat and handlebars. It was propelled by the rider pushing off the ground with his feet. Also called the Draisine, the device was created not out of fancy but necessity. Dros was looking for a substitute for the horse that had starved to death in the recent volcanic winter caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. So this guy needed to go out and fix his fences, and his horse had starved to death. He couldn't feed his horse. So the invention of the bicycle was because the guy's horse had starved to death. It didn't have pedals. You just jumped on it and pushed off, and at least you could ride down the hills and get to where you're going faster. Now, they actually marketed this with the catchphrase, "an ever-saddled horse which eats nothing." So we can actually thank the Grand Solar Minimum for the invention of the bicycle, which, hey, I love mountain biking. So I guess there's a silver lining to everything. Back to 14th century England, everyone was affected from nobles to peasants. Things got so bad in the winter of 1315 to 1316 that the peasants ate the seed grain they had stored for planting the next spring. Starvation is a very powerful thing. That was absolute suicide, knowing that you are eating the grain that is supposed to go into the ground to supply your next year's crop. By 1316, there were even rumors of cannibalism. In their misery and starvation, many people begged, stole, and murdered for what little food they could find. Even law-abiding people resorted to criminality in order to feed themselves. People who could no longer feed their families abandoned their children to fend for themselves. I've said it before, I'll say it again. This was the reason for the orphan trains in the 1800s after the year without summer. People were starving to death. They either gave their food to their children if they were good people, or they just straight abandoned them. So that's why we see all the orphan trains from the Dalton Minimum. Indeed, the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel may have originated at this time. In the story, Hansel and Gretel have been abandoned in the woods by their parents during a time of famine. They are taken in by an old woman living in a cottage. The old woman starts to heat the oven, and the children realize she is planning to roast and eat them. Gretel manages to trick the old woman into opening the oven and then pushes her in. What a pleasant bedtime story for the kiddies, huh? As the cold, wet weather continued, the famine reached its height in the spring of 1317. Finally, in the summer of that year, the weather patterns returned to normal, but it was 1322 before the food supply recovered completely. That's a full 8 years of interrupted food supplies that they went through. So what caused year after year of severe winters and cold, rainy summers? The onset of the Great Famine coincided with the end of the medieval warm period and the beginning of a little ice age, or the Wolf Minimum. The European climate was changing with cooler and wetter summers and earlier autumn storms. These were far from ideal conditions for agriculture, and with a large population to feed, it only took one failed harvest for things to get very bad very quickly. Some historians think that this terrible weather may have been caused by a volcanic eruption, perhaps that of Mount Tarawera in New Zealand, which is known to have erupted around 1314. Now, just think about back in that time frame. Now, it wasn't the theoretical Stone Age or anything. I mean, they had ships, and I'm sure they had commerce with France and, whoever was around. But if a volcano went off in New Zealand, nobody would have a clue up in England. But just like with the 1815 Mount Tambora eruption, it would appear that a volcano and a volcanic winter that ensued caused the most damage to agriculture and to the people. Now, when you look at the 1800s era, the Dalton Minimum, it wasn't just the one Mount Tambora. There was a series of large, VEI 4 and greater eruptions that took place in the years prior to that. 1808, they say it was a mysterious eruption, VEI 6 in the Southwest Pacific Ocean. 1812, La Soufrière on St. Vincent Island in the Caribbean. 1812, Awu in the Dutch East Indies. 1813, Sawanosejima in the Ryukyu Islands, Japan. And in 1814, Mayon in the Philippines. And then, of course, 1815 was the big one, Mount Tambora. Now, if you've been keeping track the last 2 years, we have had a huge amount of smaller, 50,000 feet and less explosions up into the atmosphere. We haven't had any of the large ones that get up into the stratosphere where the sulfates actually start dimming the sun. But if you ask me, a volcanic eruption is public enemy number one. Now let's touch on some of the seismic activity of that time frame. This is from the Earthquake Catalog of the British Association, where they themselves question the dating. Like I said before, the Anno Domini or AD dating system was not instituted until the 9th century. I believe it was through the Catholic Church that instituted that. So not everybody was on the same dating system. We have comparative histories. It wasn't the big one world system that we have nowadays. So France would have had their own calendar. Italy would have had their own calendar. And at some point in the future, somebody started doing comparative histories and correlating all the dates together. They may or may not have had an agenda in mind when they were doing this, especially when you think about the man-made climate change that they are pushing in our modern time. They are making big bucks off of that lie, so there is major incentive to confuse the dates to make it look like these all happen at separate times, because hey, if everybody just opened up their history book in high school and saw that all this stuff occurred at one time, then they couldn't sell the man-made agenda now, could they? These are just short little excerpts that someone cataloged back in 1852, and we'll do the time frame from 1303 to 1350. Alexandria and Acre, throughout the Peloponnesus Candia, the walls of Hama and Alexandria were partially thrown down. Some other chroniclers give the dates 1302 and 1304. So right here, they're showing very clearly that the dating may be off. And who knows? I still contend that some of this may be off by decades, just the way they've done their comparative histories. And I still think South America and European history is off by 100 years when you get back to this time frame. 1304 in Italy, exact place not mentioned, many houses thrown down. And then 1306 in Rimini, it just says that it's sometime after the quake in Candia that had the questionable dating of 1302 to 1304. 1307 Japan, it just says very violent. 1311 and 1316, this would have been during the time of the Great Famine in England. They don't have any footnotes. They just record earthquakes at Carinthia and France. 1317 in Italy, 2 shocks in 24 hours, lasted a long time. 1319 in a province of Armenia, the capital Ani or Ana was completely ruined, and many other towns and villages were reduced to the same condition. Just absolutely annihilated the capital of Armenia and several villages afterwards. And then 1320, Siena in Italy, shocks during several days and nights, and Venice was inundated. Now, they're not specific about that. I don't know if Venice sank. Maybe that was when they started all the canals there, or it could have been a tsunami. 1322 in Germany, exceedingly violent. 1322 at Geneva, Switzerland, and Pisa, Italy, several very violent shocks. Very violent, but lasting a very short time. followed by a luminous meteor the night after. So here again we have meteoric phenomena coinciding with seismic events. Now in 1328 you had Germany, Italy, especially at Perugia and the neighborhood, Rome, Norcia in the States of the Church, most violent at Norcia. Says that during a period of very rainy weather, which had been preceded by extreme heat and drought, once again we have drought and then the flooding, it just says the shocks continued at intervals for some months afterwards. So they kept having aftershocks for months. Norcia was completely ruined. 5,000 persons perished. And then they've got another event dated 1331, 2 years after. Who knows? It may have been a different chronicler of the same events. 18 shocks during the day, and the following night they did not entirely cease for a month, just like the 2 years previously. They said that the earthquakes lasted for months. Very well could have been the same event, just by different chroniclers. The sea was agitated, accompanied at Constantinople by violent atmospheric perturbations. And then 1334 and 35, still in Italy. So either they had 5 years of outrageous earthquakes, or these are just contemporary chroniclers talking about the same event. It says, in consequence of this earthquake, Monte Falterona near Di Campano separated, and an immense landslip took place, the body of earth moving more than 4 miles. The Arno and its affluent were troubled as far as Pisa for more than 2 months. So they're saying that this town slipped 4 miles from its original location, and the river was troubled for months. Now, when I look back at, say, the last video I did of Cahokia, looking at the maps from the 1800s, where it shows 2 major rivers flowing down what is now the Mississippi Valley, where we only have 1 Mississippi River that flows down through there now. When you hear about landslides moving towns 4 miles away, disrupting the river there, then that adds a little credence to the hypothesis that there could have actually been 2 main rivers in the Mississippi Valley a few hundred years ago. A major seismic event occurred, landslides, moving of mountains and whatnot, and completely changing the course of rivers. And they continue to document violent shocks, 1336 and 1337 in Italy, 1338, very violent in Japan, 1339, Italy, Syria, and the southern part of Iceland, very violent shocks, followed the next year by a violent eruption of all the volcanoes of the south of Iceland. It says all the volcanoes. With our modern weather patterns, any volcano that erupts in Iceland is going to carry the fallout straight over into the UK. And now an interesting thing on the dating, once again in Italy, they say in 1343, very violent shocks which continued more or less for 15 days. Many buildings were injured. The Darium Historicum gives the date of 1340, but the official dating they're using the following year in Constantinople and Egypt, they had many and violent shocks, and the sea inundated the shores of Constantinople. So that sounds like a tsunami. Now, Italy, that had the violent shocks for 15 days the year before, doesn't, they're right across the Mediterranean from Syria and Egypt. So doesn't it kind of sound like if you had a violent earthquake over there and a landslide or an underwater landslide, that very well could have been the cause of the tsunami that hit the other side of the Mediterranean? I don't know, it just kind of makes sense to me. And I'll end it here with 1344, southern part of Iceland and the province of Guladan in Norway. I know I said that one wrong. 50 farms were destroyed in Norway, and the river Gul disappeared under the ground, reappearing several days after and carrying with it so much debris as to close up the valley and produce an inundation. So the river, I guess a sinkhole opened up, swallowed up the river, and then a few days later, then it just mud flooded out with a bunch of debris, just like you would see, you know, out in the desert during a flash flood situation where you've just got trees and mud and it's just like a wall of concrete coming at you. And Arngrim Johansen reports this event in the year 1339, where the official dating is saying 1344. So there's a 5-year discrepancy on that one. So I guess the lesson to be learned here is when it rains, it pours. It's not just one event. These things all tend to happen simultaneously. Now, whether the dating on those earthquakes are correct, we do know that Cahokia fell during this time. There was the Great Famine in England. I've done a lot more research of other areas of the world. Those are just the two that I've done the videos on so far. Like I said, I'm going to try to keep going on this time frame and basically go around the world and start a playlist so you can get an idea of what actually happened. Now, it appears to be fact at this point that we are going into another grand solar minimum. It's called the Eddy minimum. Now, whether this is going to be a smaller one like the Dalton minimum that was pretty destructive on its own, or a larger one such as the Maunder minimum, or what appears to be the really big one, the Wolf minimum of the 1300s, remains to be seen. This is only year 2 of this grand solar minimum that we are going into, and it would appear that Big Brother is pulling all the stops, playing all the tricks they can right now to hide this from us. They're still pushing the man-made climate change agenda. They're doing the 100th monkey programming on us, getting us used to food rationing, and doing away with jobs. They are completely restructuring the economy right now, and it's not going to be good for us on the bottom rung of the ladder here. There's a huge transference of wealth going to the more affluent right now. Small businesses can't afford what they are forcing on us right now. And we haven't even got into the actual natural cycle shifts that we're going to get into. And they're already making it hard on us. So when you see me going off the rails and getting all upset about what they're pulling right now, that's why. It's because, historically these periods have been hard enough on people, but now we have this tyrannical one world government that is pulling the strings and making things hard before times have even gotten hard yet. So it can be very frustrating to know exactly what they're doing, know that they know exactly what I'm presenting to you guys, and my hands are tied. The only thing I can do is sit here and make videos about it and hope to inform as many people as I can. It's about all I can do, I guess. Hope you guys enjoyed the vid. I love you guys. Take care of yourselves out there. Static out.